Oh, hello there. Yes, so begins another weary day. Yay. Yes. Except I have to go to work today. Oh, yes, I got accused of being work shy the other day, which I always take as a compliment. I think everyone should be work shy. Who wants to go to work? It's daft. Anyway, moving on from that. A couple of days ago, there was a tweet which sort of garnered quite a lot of interest amongst nefarious left-wingers, saying, well, that's tosh. Toby Young, and was reposted by Colin Brazier, claims that, I'll let Colin explain. Projections for the 2050s suggest, I was doing a lot of work here, it's possible, again, someone born in the 50s England, where the non-white population was less than 1%, will die in a country as part of a white minority. Ooh, has there been unforced demographic change like this anywhere in recorded history? Yes, said a lot of people, and also, that's utter tosh, a lot of other people. There is just simply no way, unless every single non-white woman who is currently alive in the UK has about 10 kids, and then those kids have about 10 kids themselves, and then, no, okay, it's not a thing. It's a moral panic, which we are stuck in at the moment, okay? I think if GB News didn't slag off Prince Harry so much, they might as well just call themselves the anti-Muslim channel, because it's just wall to wall now. I'm reminded of, we'll be talking about the 80s, but anyway, I'm reminded of those Furby dolls that you sit in front of each other that eventually just keep repeating gibberish to each other because there are no other inputs. Anyway, today I thought we'd have a look at those kind of moral panics that there are around today, and the moral panics that there were then. Because very often I find in people that leave me very delightful comments is they accuse me of talking tosh because it was so much better when they were kids. It was so much better in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and the 90s and the thousands, but I don't really tend to get that sort of traffic because, let's face it, all you lot are over 55. Anyway, let's talk generically about Folk Devils and Moral Panics, which was a book by a guy called Cohen, which came out in the 1960s. He was a sociologist, but he was actually sort of a not really left-wing sociologist or a right-wing sociologist, just a sociologist, and it's one of those phrases that has gone very much into public usage. We all know what a moral panic is, but I think it's worthwhile unpacking his actual ideas, because what he said was effectively, the first thing is the concern, right? Okay, there will be something tangible. There is always a tangible thing. There's a riot in Hare Hills, or somebody gets their Rolex nicked. There's always a thing which sparks off a new moral panic. Okay, and then you have this level of hostility whereby the bad people are highlighted, young people. Oh, they're all bad, aren't they? And we'll look into how bad they are. And we're going to discover when we look at it that they're even badder than we thought. Yes. Then you get this consensus bit where fear of the subculture becomes the dominant narrative in media and social discussion. Yes, you know, all them Muslims that are all dangerous because they're all out on the streets and all in stuff, yeah? That kind of thing. There's a generic consensus out there, I think, which we can definitely see. Disproportionality. The threat is exaggerated, like I've just said. Yes, you'll notice the way that all of that discussion in and around the Hare Hills stuff basically fed enormously into everything else that came. Riots begat riots, as they always have done. Think of the 80s. Come back to that again. And volatility. A moral panic emerges suddenly and disappears suddenly, often when another moral panic takes its place. But what I want to look at today is the way that there are just simply these recurring themes with all of these stuff. And the old phrase that there is nothing new under the sun would certainly apply to a lot of the stuff I'm going to say today, in terms of there is nothing new in the sun, or indeed in GB News, or indeed any moral panic that we're faced with always has something that you can point to in the past, and it very often is equally toshy. So anyway, I thought we'd start with some of these modern concerns. Let's think about immigrants and race, because after all, it was so much better, wasn't it, in the 1960s and 1970s and 1980s, when, before Blair, which is the current narrative, when everything was great, because everything just was great. I remember growing up and everything was just great because I was 3. Yeah? Except, of course, there were moral panics in the 1970s about muggers. It was... There's a very good book about this by a guy called excellent and now sadly dead sociologist called Stuart Hall, policing the crisis. Sorry, I nearly forgot there. Yeah, and he goes into the way that the fears that there were in the 1970s, stoked by the media, right, of black teenagers on the streets of London, fed into the notion of the folk devil of the mugger. It was a phrase that had been imported from America. So whereas we had quite a bit of street crime in the 1970s, sorry to disappoint you, but there was a lot more in many ways than there is now, but that's another story. Yeah, and the fact that we had all this stuff, basically it got the word mugger attached to it. So suddenly everyone was being mugged. Suddenly it was a major problem, and suddenly we needed to police it enormously, very, very harshly, like we did, which led out very directly to the 1981 riots. Yes, as sure as Margaret Thatcher follows Jim Callaghan, because a lot of this, of course, was on Margaret Thatcher's watch, and a lot of the concerns that there are amongst the current crop of Conservatives were equally relevant in those days. Now, let's move on to immigrants, shall we? Yeah, because Margaret Thatcher had this whole thing about us being swamped. We were being swamped by Asians, yes? These days, Asians can be quite nice, depending on who they are, provided they're not Pakistani men or Bangladeshi men or Afghan men or just, I think, generically Indian subcontinent men. Maybe, unless you're a Sikh, in which case it's obviously fine. But Margaret Thatcher, don't forget, talked about us, our culture being swamped by the aliens. I mean, even Nigel Farage has this kind of weird sense of nostalgia, because I've seen him actually claim in the recent past that Britain really, really welcomed all those Asians in the 70s and 80s, and I'm sorry, but that's an absolute lie. Right, okay? These days we might think that Asian kids are good at maths, but in those days they were coming over here and needed a good kicking. Particularly, they needed a bashing if they were from Pakistan. You may remember that phrase. Anyway, moving on, let's think about some of those other things, because these days, of course, we have trans, don't we? Yes, because we've never had that sort of panic around that sort of stuff before. And, as certain politicians might say, I'm thinking of Margaret Thatcher, young people are being persuaded or being taught that they have an inalienable right to, as she would have put it, be gay. Yes, because we had HIV, didn't we? Which was all very, very, very threatening, and we needed to definitely protect children from gay people because they were predators. Yes, needed Section 28 because, after all, no one would be gay if the teachers didn't mention it. It's all the teachers' fault and the gay people's fault because they're after our kids. Yes. I'm sure that doesn't ring very many huge bells around trans issues today, does it? No. And feeding on from that, of course, there was this ongoing sense that the 1960s and all those dreadful things like having effective contraception and ability to divorce people, and indeed, maybe even if you needed to have an abortion, were all basically very, very bad. And the totemic one of this, in terms of Thatcher's moral panic, which fed into loads of benefits things, of course, as well, was the single mother, who was directly responsible for all of the ills of society, as indeed they still are, because it's the main reason why black kids wield machetes. Their dads have left. Yes, isn't it? Or maybe it isn't. I don't know. Has anything changed? I don't think so, particularly. This comes down to, there was a famous book from 1983 by Neil Postman called Disappearing Childhood, and there was this idea that children were being robbed of their childhood. Okay? 1983. 1983, not 1993 or 2003 or 2013 or 2023, but then, yeah? It was a very odd time in terms of threats to children. Some of you may dimly remember the bogus social workers that would go around, something we imported from the States. For about 3 years, there were loads of bogus social workers that would knock on your door and try and take your kids. and then they completely disappeared. Strange. Although I have, in researching this, seen a couple of stories from as recent as 2014 about a bogus care worker anyway, yeah. And of course, in terms of threats to children, who can forget video nasties? All parents in the 1980s got a video recorder, right? Okay. And the first film they borrowed for it was I Spit on Your Grave, right? And then the second film they borrowed was Lesbian Ninja Nazi Camp Experiment of Death 3 or something, okay? And the newspapers melted down because kids were being allowed to watch whatever they want, and it was ruining their childhood. It actually got to the extent, in terms of, actually as well, tying into this kind of law and order thing, that the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles had to be called the Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles, because if they hadn't have been, I would have been killed by nunchucks on a regular basis. Yes, thank God we didn't have to suffer that particular apocalyptic death. I know it sounds funny and stupid, but these days, of course, nobody cares because kids can watch anything they like on their phones and it's fine. Or it isn't fine, depending on which bit of the moral panic we're in. At the moment, I think it's fine, okay? And of course, leading on to that, of course, it's all the internet's fault that everything's bad. But before the internet, we had loads and loads of reasons why kids did bad things. You may remember, again, with the introduction of the internet, that there was a brief flurry of kids committing suicide because people on the internet had told them so, particularly in Cornwall for some reason. I seem to recall that was back in the 90s. I could be wrong, but of course we've had all this before. Don't forget that if you play certain heavy metal music backwards, you will commit suicide. Who can forget, of course, Footloose, the film, whereby the kids had to be protected from music. We all know that the kids, obviously, in the 70s had to be protected from punk rock. What on earth was going on there? Rap music, undoubtedly, would force you to take drugs and machine gun people. And so it goes on. You know, think of heavy metal and Satan. Satan, 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 Satan. You see, you're going to commit suicide now. Or maybe not. Never really understood how you can play music backwards and your brain you play music forwards and your brain mentally reverses it and you commit suicide. I don't get it. Yes, nuts. Absolute stupidity on a stick, but loads of people back in those days would have swore blind because everybody read about it in the newspapers, didn't they? Yeah, so it must be true. And finally, I mean, generically through all of this is fears about communism, because we still have that. We just simply call it woke now, don't we? Yeah. But those commie teachers would be after you. The Conservatives in particular was very, very worried about communist teachers doing things. And anyone that grows up today, obviously, has been very badly affected by communist teachers from the 80s, or the 90s, or the 60s, or the 70s, haven't they? Which is really odd that I get so many people in my comments that aren't very left-wing. Odd. Yes, it's almost like lots of these things aren't real. But maybe that's just me being a lefty teacher. I mean, I would say that, wouldn't I? Anyway, do have a lovely Monday. Oh, I'm in a frivolous mood today. Yes, do enjoy.